The moment a king dies, the world sees mourning. But inside the monarchy, something far colder begins. Because when King Charles III is gone, it won't just mark the end of a reign, it will trigger a ruthless reset. And for Camilla, queen consort, the first 24 hours could quietly erase everything she spent decades building. It doesn't happen gradually. It doesn't wait for public emotion to settle. The shift begins instantly, the second the system confirms that King Charles III is no longer there to hold it together. And while the world focuses on ceremony, tradition, and legacy, something far more clinical unfolds behind palace walls. A transfer of power so precise that it leaves no space for ambiguity. Because in the monarchy, identity is not personal, it's positional. And that's exactly where the first fracture appears. Right now, Camilla, queen consort, exists within the system through one defining connection. She is the partner of the reigning monarch. That role carries status, access, authority, and visibility. But the moment that connection ends, the system doesn't pause to adjust emotionally. It recalculates. And the recalculation is immediate. Within minutes, the title, Queen Consort, effectively dissolves. Not symbolically, structurally. It no longer applies because the position it was attached to no longer exists. In its place, a different label emerges, one that sounds dignified on the surface but carries a very different reality underneath. A widow of a former reign. Now, to the public, that may still feel royal. But inside the hierarchy, it changes everything. Because the difference between being part of the active structure and being adjacent to it is massive. And this is where the power dynamic shifts sharply. Because at that exact same moment, a new center of authority forms. Prince William becomes king. Not gradually. Not ceremonially. Instantly. The structure doesn't wait for coronations or celebrations. The authority transfers the second the previous monarch is gone. Which means control transfers too. Control over roles. Control over access. Control over what remains, and what doesn't. And here's where the situation becomes far more personal than it first appears. Because unlike previous transitions, this one carries history. Not just institutional history, but emotional memory. The relationship between Prince William and Camilla, queen consort, has always existed within a complex space shaped by the past, by public perception, and by deeply personal experiences that were never fully erased. Now, whether that history influences decisions is something no official source will ever confirm. But the context exists. And context matters, especially in a system where authority becomes absolute overnight. So the question begins to form. What happens when structural power and personal history intersect at the exact same moment? Because this isn't just a change in title. It's a complete repositioning inside one of the most rigid hierarchies in the world. And that repositioning affects everything. It affects where she stands. Literally. In formal events, order of precedence determines who walks first, who sits where, who is acknowledged before others. These aren't small details. They are visible indicators of power. And once the transition happens, that order shifts instantly. From center to side. But it doesn't stop there. Because with the loss of active status comes the quiet removal of influence. Meetings she once attended, decisions she was briefed on, events she helped shape, all of that becomes restricted. Not out of hostility, but out of structure. The system narrows around the new monarch, and anything outside that core begins to fade. And that fading happens quickly. Because the monarchy doesn't operate on sentiment, it operates on continuity. Every decision is designed to reinforce the current center of power, not preserve the previous one. Which means the transition isn't just about who gains authority. It's about who loses relevance. And relevance, in this system, is everything. But here's where it becomes even more unsettling. Because all of this happens before the public fully processes what's occurred. Before the ceremonies begin. Before the mourning period settles in. While the world is still reacting emotionally, the structure has already completed its reset. And that reset leaves very little room for anything that doesn't align with the new order. So while headlines focus on the beginning of a new reign, something else is happening quietly in the background. A removal, a repositioning, a narrowing of space. And the real question is no longer whether change is coming, but how much of it happens within those first 24 hours. Because if the first shift was about identity, the next one is about something even more tangible. And it doesn't wait. The moment that initial shift settles, the next transformation begins to unfold in a way that feels even more tangible, because while titles redefine identity, control over space and assets determines reality, and in the royal system, space is never emotional. It is governed by ownership, protocol, and authority that transfers instantly the second Prince William becomes king, meaning that every residence associated with the previous reign is no longer held by personal attachment but absorbed into the structure of the new monarch. And that is where the situation for Camilla, Queen Consort, begins to shift in a way that cannot be softened by ceremony or tradition, because the residences she has lived in for years, including Clarence House and Highgrove, are not privately owned in the conventional sense but tied to the Crown Estate and the Duchy of Cornwall, both of which effectively fall under the control of the new king, creating a scenario where what once felt permanent suddenly becomes conditional. And this is where the difference between living within the monarchy and belonging to it becomes impossible to ignore, because once the transition occurs, every room, every corridor, every private garden she once moved through as part of the inner structure is reclassified under a different authority, and that authority now has the power to reassign, restructure, or completely redefine how those spaces are used going forward. And while no official statement would ever frame it as removal or displacement, the practical reality is that continued residence is no longer guaranteed, because the monarchy prioritizes functional hierarchy over personal history, meaning that Clarence House, traditionally associated with the heir or central operations of the royal structure, may be repurposed to align with the new configuration of power, whether that involves administrative use, reassignment to another senior royal, or integration into the operational base of the reigning king. And at the same time, Highgrove, which carries not just symbolic weight but also ties to the Duchy of Cornwall, transitions fully under the control of the monarch, making any continued connection to it dependent not on past association but on present approval. And this is where the emotional dimension begins to intersect with the structural one, because these are not just buildings. They are environments tied to decades of personal history. Yet within the system they are treated as assets. First and memory second, and that creates a silent but unmistakable shift, where presence becomes permission-based rather than assumed, and even if alternative arrangements are offered, such as a grace-and-favor residence within the Windsor estate or a quieter private setting, the contrast is immediate, because moving from a central, highly visible residence tied to active royal life into a more secluded or secondary location represents not just relocation but repositioning within the hierarchy, and that repositioning is reinforced by the fact that staff, services, and operational support are also tied to the sovereign, meaning that the teams that once maintained daily life, from household coordination to logistical planning, are subject to review, redistribution, or reduction as part of the new king's approach to modernization. And if that approach aligns with the widely discussed concept of a streamlined monarchy, then it is likely that resources will be concentrated around the core working royals, leaving those outside that circle with a significantly reduced level of support. And this is where the transformation becomes impossible to overlook, because it is no longer abstract, it is visible in daily life, in the scale of operations, in the access to spaces, in the rhythm of activity, and in the subtle but constant reminders that the center has shifted. And once that shift is complete, it does not reverse, because the system is designed to move forward, not to preserve parallel structures from a previous reign, which means that every decision moving forward, whether it involves residence, staffing, or access, is made through the lens of the new monarch's priorities rather than past arrangements. And that creates a situation where continuity exists for the institution but not necessarily for the individuals who were part of the previous structure. And this is the moment where the reality of the transition fully settles in, because it is no longer about titles or announcements, it is about the physical and operational environment changing in real time. And as that environment reshapes itself around the new center of power, one question begins to take on greater weight than any other, because if control over space defines presence within the monarchy, then what happens when that control is no longer yours? And more importantly, what does that mean for everything else that depends on it? Because as significant as losing space might be, it is still only one part of a much larger transformation that is just beginning to unfold. As that shift in space quietly settles into a new reality, the next layer of transformation begins to unfold in a way that is even more symbolic yet far more visible to the world, because within the monarchy, symbolism is not decorative, it is structural, and few things carry more symbolic weight than the jewels, the artifacts, and the visual markers of royal identity that define how authority is seen and remembered, which is why the transition of access to these items becomes one of the most Immediate and quietly decisive changes following the passing of King Charles III, because unlike personal possessions, the vast majority of the royal collection does not belong to the individual wearing it but to the crown itself, meaning that the moment Prince William becomes king, he becomes the sole authority over how these items are allocated, displayed, and used, and that authority is not ceremonial. It is absolute within the framework of royal protocol, which creates a situation where access that once felt routine becomes entirely dependent on approval, and this is where the shift becomes impossible to ignore, because the visual identity that once reinforced the position of Camilla, Queen Consort, as part of the central structure begins to change, not through confrontation, but through quiet reassignment, because the pieces that define that image, from historic tiaras to heirloom necklaces, are part of a controlled system of loans that can be redirected at any time, and, under a new reign, that redirection is not just likely, it is expected, because the priority of the system is always to align its most powerful symbols with the current center of authority, which now shifts toward the new king and his immediate royal circle, particularly the new queen, who becomes the primary figure through which those symbols are expressed, and this is where the contrast becomes striking. Because what once appeared as continuity begins to feel like replacement, as the same. Pieces that once appeared in one context begin to reappear in another, reinforcing the narrative that the institution has moved forward, and while no official statement would ever frame this as removal, the effect is the same, because the absence of access is as visible as the presence once was, and that absence extends beyond public appearances into the deeper structure of ownership and control. Because items that may have been assumed to be personal or privately held can, in certain cases, fall into complex categories depending on how they were acquired, whether through the Duchy of Cornwall, royal trusts, or sovereign-linked funds. And this creates a situation where a detailed review of assets becomes not just possible but necessary, particularly if the new monarch chooses to apply a more structured or modernized approach to asset management. And while such reviews are rarely discussed publicly, their implications can be significant, because they determine not only who can use certain items but also who retains them, and under what conditions. And this is where the transformation becomes deeply personal, because objects that have been part of daily life for years, even decades, can suddenly become subject to reclassification, not because of personal dispute, but because of structural realignment, and that realignment is guided by one principle above all others, which is that anything tied to the crown must ultimately serve the crown as it exists now, not as it existed before. And this is why the transition feels so immediate, because it does not wait for emotional adjustment, it follows protocol. And protocol operates on the assumption that the system must remain visually and symbolically coherent at all times, which means that every public appearance, every photograph, every ceremonial moment must reflect the current hierarchy without ambiguity. And that requirement drives decisions that, while quiet, are unmistakable in their impact, because they reshape how individuals are perceived within the structure, and perception, in a monarchy, is inseparable from authority, which means that as access to these symbols shifts, so does the perceived position within the hierarchy. And that shift is reinforced repeatedly through visibility, through absence, and through the subtle but consistent reallocation of what the institution chooses to highlight. And as this process continues, it creates a new visual narrative that aligns entirely with the new reign, leaving very little room for remnants of the previous one to occupy the same space. And this is where the deeper realization begins to take hold, because what is being adjusted is not just access to objects, it is access to identity itself. And once that adjustment is complete, the transformation becomes irreversible, because the system has already moved on, and when the system moves on, it does so completely, leaving behind only what it chooses to preserve, and nothing more, which raises a question that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, because if the symbols of power can be reassigned so quickly and so completely, then what happens to the structures that support the person who once held them, and more importantly, what happens when those structures begin to change as well, because as significant as the loss of symbolic identity may be, it is still only one part of a much larger shift that is now beginning to take shape in ways that are far more immediate and far more personal. As the symbolic layer begins to shift and the visual identity tied to the previous reign quietly realigns around the new center of authority, the next transformation moves into something far more immediate and far more personal, because beyond titles, residences, and jewels, there exists an entire operational system that sustains daily life within the monarchy, and that system, unlike tradition, is not preserved out of sentiment but adjusted according to function, cost, and relevance, which means that the moment Prince William assumes the throne, the structure that once supported Camilla, Queen Consort, begins to come under review, not as a reflection of personal standing but as part of a broader recalibration of how resources are distributed within a modernized royal framework. And this is where the shift becomes impossible to overlook, because the network of staff, advisors, aides, and operational teams that once existed as a dedicated extension of her role are not permanently assigned to the individual but to the function she occupied, meaning that when that function changes, so too does the structure that supports it, and this creates a situation where what once felt stable becomes conditional, because contracts are reassessed, roles are redefined, and responsibilities are either absorbed into the central system or quietly phased out, depending on how they align with the priorities of the new monarch. And if those priorities emphasize a streamlined, efficiency-driven approach, as has been widely suggested, then the implications become even more significant, because it means that support is concentrated around the core working members of the royal family, leaving those outside that core with a reduced level of operational backing, and this reduction is not necessarily abrupt, but it is deliberate, unfolding through administrative adjustments that gradually reshape the scale and visibility of daily activity. And as this process continues, the difference becomes increasingly clear, because the rhythm of life changes, the level of coordination decreases, and the sense of constant movement that once defined an active royal role begins to slow, replaced by a quieter, more limited pattern of engagement. And this is where the psychological dimension begins to intersect with the structural one, because the presence of staff is not just functional. It reinforces status, visibility, and influence, and when that presence diminishes, the effect is felt not only in logistics but in perception, both internally and externally. And this extends even further into areas that are less visible but equally significant, such as security and transportation, because these elements are among the most tightly controlled and carefully allocated resources within the monarchy, reserved primarily for those who are actively performing official duties. And once that status changes, the justification for maintaining the same level of provision becomes subject to review, meaning that security arrangements may be adjusted to reflect a different level of public engagement, and travel privileges that were once seamlessly available may now require coordination, approval, or even alternative arrangements. And while these changes may be framed as practical or necessary within the context of modernization, their impact is deeply personal, because they alter the way daily life is experienced, replacing a system of immediate access with one that is more measured and, in some cases, more limited. And this is where the transformation becomes fully tangible, because it is no longer about abstract concepts or symbolic shifts. It is about the lived reality of operating within a system that has redefined its priorities, and that reality is reinforced through countless small adjustments that, when combined, create a completely different environment from the one that existed before. And as this environment continues to take shape, it becomes increasingly clear that the transition is not a single event but an ongoing process, one that gradually but decisively repositions individuals within the hierarchy. And once that repositioning is complete, it becomes the new normal, because the system does not revert to previous configurations once it has adapted to a new center of authority. And this is why the first 24 hours carry so much weight, because they establish the direction of everything that follows, setting in motion a series of changes that extend far beyond that initial moment. And as those changes unfold, they raise a question that becomes more pressing with each passing stage, because if the operational support, the daily structure, and the practical framework of royal life can be redefined so quickly and so completely, then what remains of the position that once depended on them? And more importantly, how does that position continue to exist within a system that has already moved forward without it? Because as the structural layers continue to shift, the final transformation begins to emerge, one that is less about systems and more about perception, and it is in that final stage that the true impact of the transition becomes impossible to ignore. As those structural changes settle into place and the operational rhythm of daily life reshapes itself around a new center of authority, the final transformation begins to take hold in a way that is less visible but far more permanent, because beyond titles, residences, symbols, and support systems, there is one layer that ultimately defines position within the monarchy more than anything else. And that layer is perception, the collective understanding of who matters, who is seen, and who remains at the center of attention. And in a system built on visibility and continuity, once that perception shifts, it does not simply adjust, it resets entirely, which is exactly what begins to happen as the public narrative transitions from the era of King Charles III to the reign of Prince William, because with that transition comes a new focal point, a new representation of the monarchy that is reinforced through every appearance, every headline, and every carefully managed moment of visibility. And as that new narrative takes shape, the previous one does not remain alongside it. It recedes, gradually at first, and then more definitively, until it becomes part of the background rather than the present. And this is where the experience of Camilla, Queen Consort, changes in a way that cannot be reversed, because while earlier stages of the transition affected position, access, and structure, this stage affects recognition itself, determining how often she is seen, how prominently she is placed, and how frequently she is included in the evolving story of the monarchy. And as the system moves forward, its focus narrows around the new king and his immediate circle, particularly the new queen, whose role becomes central to the public identity of the institution, and this creates a natural but unmistakable contrast, because where attention once existed, it now shifts elsewhere. And that shift is reinforced continuously through media coverage, public engagements, and institutional messaging, all of which are designed to establish clarity around the new hierarchy, leaving little room for ambiguity or overlap with the previous structure. And this is why the final transformation feels so definitive, because it is not enforced through direct action but through absence, the absence of appearances, the absence of mentions, the absence of visibility that once defined relevance. And over time, that absence becomes the new reality, shaping how the individual is perceived both within the institution and by the public at large. And this is where the emotional dimension becomes most apparent, because while earlier changes can be understood as procedural or structural, this shift touches on identity, on the sense of place within a system that has already moved forward. And that sense of displacement is reinforced by the fact that the monarchy does not pause to preserve parallel narratives. It advances, continuously aligning itself with the present and the future rather than the past, and this forward movement is reflected in every aspect of its operation, from the distribution of roles to the allocation of attention, ensuring that the focus remains firmly on the current center of authority, and as that focus intensifies, the space for anything outside that center continues to diminish, creating a situation where the previous prominence is not actively removed but simply replaced. And replacement, in this context, is more final than removal, because it signals that the system has already completed its transition, leaving no structural pathway back to the position that once existed. And this is why the first 24 hours carry such profound significance, because they do not just mark the beginning of a new reign, they establish the framework through which every subsequent moment will be interpreted, setting the tone for how roles are defined, how visibility is distributed, and how the narrative of the monarchy evolves moving forward. And as that framework takes hold, it becomes clear that the transformation is not temporary, it is foundational, reshaping the hierarchy in a way that aligns entirely with the new order. And once that alignment is complete, it becomes the reference point for everything that follows, leaving behind a clear but unspoken conclusion, because while the transition may begin with ceremony and public attention, its true impact is defined by the quiet, irreversible shifts that occur beneath the surface. And those shifts ultimately determine not just who holds power, but who remains part of the story at all, which leads to the final question that lingers beyond the immediate moment. Because if the monarchy is built on continuity and visibility, then what does it truly mean when that visibility fades? And how does that redefine the legacy of someone who once stood at the very center of it? So now it comes down to you. Do you see this as a natural transition of power, or something far more calculated beneath the surface? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more deep, high-retention royal breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for what comes next.